Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for the second of our conversations on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This one focuses on the global implications of the invasion. I'm Hilary Landorf, Executive Director of the Office of Global Learning Initiatives at FIU. Our office is tasked with ensuring that every student who attends FIU learns to make connections between local and global issues, embrace diverse perspectives, and move towards solving complex problems that transcend borders of all kinds. We do that by supporting more than 280 courses throughout the curriculum in which our diverse students collaborate to analyze and address local and global problems, and by offering events like this one, in which speakers engage us in discussions about pressing issues of our time and inspire us to become part of the solution. Co-sponsoring the conversation today are the FIU chapter of the Sigma Iota Rho Honor Society and the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, known as SIPA. We have three distinguished panelists today. David Kramer is a senior fellow at SIPA and managing director of global policy at the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas, Texas. Kramer has vast and deep experience in the conflict region, starting with his degrees from Tufts and Harvard in Soviet studies to his work at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, to serving 8 years in the US Department of State, including as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Marcus Thiel is an Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU, and Director of FIU's Jean Monnet European Center of Excellence, which promotes teaching and research in European Union studies. Dr. Thiel's research interests include the political sociology of the European Union, EU politics, and identity politics. And Tatiana Kostadinova is a professor of politics and international relations, also at FIU. Her interests include political institutions with a special on electoral systems and reform, East European democratic transition, and comparative public policy. Her many publications include the book, Political Corruption in Eastern Europe, Politics After Communism. We're going to start by giving each of the panelists time to answer one general question. While they're speaking, feel free to pose other questions for the panelists in the chat box. We will then have plenty of time for our experts to address your questions. So the first question is for Tatiana. Why does Russia care so much about Ukraine? If you would, please give us brief background information about Ukraine and the history of its relationship with Russia.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. There is a very long and complicated history of relations between the people who populate today's Russia and Ukraine, so it would be very difficult to summarize it in a few minutes. I'll try to mark some developments and events which I consider the most important moments, which might help understand what's happening now. First of all, in a recent direct line speech, President Putin stated that Russians and Ukrainians are virtually one people, that they are single whole. In fact, many Russians have historically perceived Ukraine as an integral part of the Russian realm. That is why the 1991 departure of Ukraine from the USSR felt more painful than the separation of the other republics. So reminding the Russian public of the close relations, cultural, Slavic cultural, and Eastern Orthodox religious, by doing this, Putin is trying to offer justification of his actions and make them more legitimate. Paradoxically, the beginning of statehood for both Russians and Ukrainians started with the establishment of the Kievan Rus in the 9th century, which was a medieval kingdom. So the modern states of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine all claimed this kingdom as their cultural ancestor. Yet the capital of that kingdom was the capital of a city of Ukraine today, Kiev. Ukraine was one of the founders of the USSR in December 1922. So, and this is quite symbolic, I think. Ukraine had a founding role, so its departure was significant in 91. And also, there is an anniversary to celebrate this year, which is 100 years since the establishment of the USSR. So President Putin is trying to restore the Soviet Union 100 years after its initial creation, and also to leave his name in history, it says. Another important historical fact that marks the relations is the famine of the 1930s. Stalin's policies of collectivization of agriculture sparked a series of peasant rebellions in some parts of Ukraine in 1931, 1932. Stalin and the Communist Party took extremely harsh measures against opposition to collectivization in Ukraine. There were communist apparatchiks who were sent to ransack their homes. There was also the female played a large role in the Ukrainian public memory for years to come. The beginning of World War II, another important moment. The beginning of the war for the Soviet Union, which was in 1941, when the Germans invaded big parts of the western territory of the Soviet Union. Initially, the Germans were greeted by some of the Ukrainian populace as liberators from Stalin. So there was this belief that Germany could be their natural ally in attainment of independence. So there was proclaimed restoration of statehood by the Ukrainians, but the Nazis quickly showed this would not happen. So this moment in history and the associated names of Stepan Bandera and others have been used by Putin's regime today to portray today's independence movement in Ukraine as neo-Nazi, as fascist, etc. So this would be another legitimization of the invasion that he undertook. Another moment after a 45-year return under Soviet control was also the declaration of independence, which happened through a referendum on December 1st, 1991, when Ukraine declared its demand for independence. It withstood pressures from Kremlin to support Gorbachev's idea of a restructured union and consider its move to independence. So the same month, in December, the three, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, signed an agreement to dissolve the USSR and establish a Commonwealth of the independent states, which Ukraine never ratified the chapter of later. So the turbulent relations between Russia and Ukraine after 1991 seems to have been inevitable. There are several dimensions of those tensions. One is, of course, Ukraine's dependence on Russia for fossil fuels. Russia could stop the supply to Ukraine, but Ukraine also could interrupt the supply through the pipeline for Europe. So this created a lot of tension and conflict between the two states. Another important thing is that the situation of the Russian minority group in Ukraine, which is about 20% of the population. While in the USSR, these people used to have a psychological majority status because the Russians were the majority within the Union. Russian was not recognized as a second official language, however, immediately after 1991. So further complications by Russia, who vowed to defend the rights of ethnic Russians in the near abroad to which Ukraine belongs, also contributed to the escalation of the conflict. And finally, Ukraine's desire to join the European structures of integration, its pro-European trajectory. This has been in conflict with Russia's foreign policy goals to create a buffer zone and to prevent the spread of liberal democracy in its neighborhood. An association agreement with the EU was halted in 2013, which sparked huge protests and violence that escalated and ended with the annexation of Crimea by Russia, and also the announcing of two separatist republics of Eastern Ukraine, Lugansk and Donetsk. So what emerges here is a conflict in which, on the one hand, Ukraine wants to claim its European identity and to become part of the EU and NATO. On the other hand, we have Russian foreign policy agenda that is totally different. Russia wants Ukraine to be part of its EU-Russian Union. So what Putin has done was he has expressed his strong disagreement with that, and that Ukraine actually doesn't have the right to exist as a separate nation and to make decisions, independent decisions for the future, which seems to be sounds as a return back to the previous Brezhnev's doctrine of limited sovereignty. In other words, Ukraine is a separate country, but it's not actually 100% sovereign. This reminds us a lot about the Cold War and the actual intentions of the regime in Kremlin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tatiana. Very, very enlightening. Next, Marcus, what are your views on the short, mid, and long-term implications of the war on Ukraine for Western Europe? And if you could, please talk about how Germany has begun to rethink its place in the world in the last few weeks.
Yes, thank you. Sounds good. I'll try to also, I have a lot more to say, but maybe in the Q&A we can go into detail on some of these things. So thanks, first of all, for inviting me. I think that's a very, of course, important topic. Obviously, a lot of interest there. It's not only the Ukrainian tragedy, it's obviously a global geopolitical conflict that could all bring us to the brink of annihilation, you know, but on the other hand, it also gives us, in many ways, a clearer view of the international system and how it shapes up in the 21st century, because that was pretty unclear for the past 20 years, if you think about it. It revitalized the EU after, you know, like 15 years of crisis, and it possibly strengthened the Western international order, but we have to see about that, particularly if you think about 2024 and the US presidential elections. For me, it's also a little bit personal because my father was a German child refugee fleeing from the Soviets, from Eastern Prussia. So, you know, this is certainly something that I'm quite interested in. Anyway, with regards to Europe, which is my focus of research, and Western Europe and the European Union, which is sort of the political framework of the 27 states in Europe. After 2014 and the Crimea invasion, the European Union already imposed sanctions. We can talk about later about the effect of these sanctions. They were not as strongly pronounced as they are now, and probably not as effective. It also developed, as Tatiana said, the association agreement with the European Union. And it launched a free trade area agreement with that and introduced the visa-free travel for Ukrainians. Now, after post the invasion of February 24th, there has been already a first EU institutional tranche of 600 million euros being made available to Ukraine. That is only part of a larger 1.5 billion euro financial tranche that the EU, the member states, and the EU institutions in Brussels provide as macroeconomic financial emergency aid to Ukraine, right? To help out, you know, with everything from humanitarian to defense, and just sort of, food, shelter, and so on. Since 2014, since the Crimea invasion, the EU and the EU institutions have provided collectively over 17 billion in grants and loans. So you can see there is a strong connection, and that connection, however, together with the visa-free travel that Ukrainians were provided with, have also moved Ukraine closer to Europe, and that has certainly played a part in the ratcheting up of tensions that we see now today. Of course, that money was also intended to be to support a reform agenda in Ukraine, because it had to deal with all kinds of rule of law issues, corruption, governmental instability, and so on and so on. And maybe we can talk later about to what extent that may be a factor, cause, effect, and so on. Now, also not only the EU has provided a lot of aid, but also there were lots of national repercussions. I mean, Germany, my own country of origin, has made a 180-degree U-turn in German foreign policy. And I'll say more about it in a little bit later. France, we have right now the French presidential election campaigns, and France and Germany after Brexit and leaving the UK, leaving the EU, those are the two dominant countries. President Macron, he seems to be likely to win the presidential elections, in part based on his sort of strong leadership through the Ukraine crisis. Central and Eastern European countries that previously were very hesitant to welcome Syrian and Afghani refugees, they are now instrumental in supporting the up to 3 million refugees that we've seen just over the last 3 weeks. Poland is mending fences with Brussels and the EU institution. The UK, after Brexit, is suddenly cooperating with the EU again. And all the major international institutions, from the UN to the G7 to the Bretton Woods institutions, are all working together in kind of, isolating Russia and putting the pressure on Russia. So there's a lot of sort of tectonic strategic shift for Europe as well as for the individual member states. We don't know exactly where it will be going, but in the medium to long term, I would say there are 4 major factors that we should take a look at or think about. So those are, well, the impact of the economic sanctions, particularly with regards to energy. The second, the impact of the increased refugee waves that will be coming from Ukraine to pretty much everywhere in Europe. Thirdly, the buildup of a more stronger EU foreign policy. And then fourth, the question of, European Union as well as NATO accession, right? Which both are heavily debated. Just a few words about each of those. With the first one, this impact of the sanctions. This is now the EU has in about 4 weeks had 4 rounds of extensive sanction, the most extensive sanction ever against a country that they wanted to engage as a partner previously. You probably all are familiar of the range of sanctions, anything from diplomatic sanctions to travel sanctions, asset freezes, luxury products are not allowed, the prohibition of investments into the Russian energy markets, which will in the long term isolate and hurt Russia really painfully. But what has not been done in the European Union is what the Biden administration has done, and that is sort of cutting back or basically stopping the import of Russian oil and gas, which the Europeans are dependent for 40% of their total energy needs. Granted, the US is only relies for 3% of their gas imports, right? So the negative effects are not as heavy on the US as on Europe. The EU has announced plans to severely slash or drastically reduce the import of Russian oil and gas, but basically, they didn't mention a concrete goal, and they said something, we want to phase out that energy dependence by 2027 to 2030. Now, if you ask me, that is way too long. But on the other hand, the Europeans are also very adamant about trying to achieve their climate change goals. And if they're not having, recourse to Russian oil and gas, they will have to find alternatives. A lot of alternatives would be nuclear or coal, and you can see that that is problematic in itself. But at the current moment, the EU is still shelling out about 1 billion euros per day to Russia, thereby indirectly financing, right, Russia's war against Ukraine. And so the Europeans really need to get a grip on that, as complex and complicated and painful as it may be. Secondly, there's the question of refugees. The refugee influx is tremendous. We have already 3 million, 1 million per week. There are estimates that there may be about 5 to 10 million refugees ending up across the European Union and further in the region. So the European Union implemented, or better activated for the first time, a law that they had on the books already, but that was never implemented. And that is the EU's Temporary Protection Directive, which automatically came from the Balkan Wars in 2001. And that automatically grants any war refugees unlimited, or basically 3-year temporary stay without having to claim asylum. And that is obviously a big advantage for the Russian civilians that are right now going west. In addition to that, the EU has also provided $500 million in humanitarian aid to help actors within Ukraine, but also, of course, in Central Eastern European countries that receive these refugees. However, again, we have to be kind of worried, or at least consider that the countries that are now most heavily affected, including Poland, which received 1.5 million of these 3 million refugees. Poland was very skeptical with regards to the receiving non-European refugees in the past. And I'm sure that Putin has counted on trying the destabilizing effect that a monumental wave of refugees could have in the medium to long term, right? So I'm a little worried about that. Now, with regards to the European security policy, the Europeans are very strong economically, but their security policy, for a variety of reasons, was already fairly weak developed. This may lead to a revitalization and a more stronger foreign policy development in the medium to long term. For the first time, the EU has provided direct military support to the Ukrainian army, and that's pretty, unprecedented. There will be a new strategic concept coming out this year, later this year, in tandem with NATO's strategic concept. So they're also working very closely in that sense together with NATO. And the EU has also, for the first time, activated the so-called European Peace Facility. It's maybe a little bit of a misnomer, but because it really supplies 500 million euros to the Ukraine for lethal military material, but also for ammunition and sort of logistical support for weapons of arms, because the Europeans see that you can only defend peace if you really sort of, if you prepare for war in that sense. So there's a nascent European defense policy, but we have to see how this will shape out in the future. The details have to be worked out together, particularly with regards to NATO, and the EU's long-term strategic orientation is also unclear. Again, I refer here back to the Europeans having become much more distant to the US after the Trump administration, and the French in particular favor this concept of Europe's strategic autonomy, meaning non-alignment neither with the US nor with Russia or China in the future. So we'll see where this will end up in a couple of years. Lastly, the question of EU and NATO accession. I'm not going to talk now much about NATO accession because of the time, but obviously Ukrainian President Zelensky wanted to have the European Union accession negotiations fast-tracked. Such a fast-track membership such a process doesn't exist. There are 4 stages, from the candidacy of the country to receiving candidate status from Brussels, to years of negotiations, to membership. Well, the Europeans can certainly accept the Ukraine as a candidate, providing it candidate status, but that may also, as you know, further inflame some of the geopolitical tension and pressures, right, between Russia and the West. And I would almost want to argue for NATO, for NATO neutrality in that sense. But one more minute that I want to spend on Germany. Germany, there has been a tremendous fundamental shift. I mean, Germany after World War II obviously pursued a pacifistic foreign policy. Some would say that was not in line with its economic and political power in Europe. That has changed for sure. Olaf Scholz, the current chancellor, the Social Democratic chancellor, provided 100 billion extra packet. He, in effect, doubled the defense spending from 2021 to 2022. He will buy also US F-35 bombers that have better tactical mobilities. And so the Europeans, or the Germans, with German public opinion and support, by the way, that means the Germans will also approximate the 2% of GDP expenditures, defense expenditures on security that is required, or that's a NATO guideline. In that sense, there has been really a fundamental shift in German foreign policy that is also supported by the Green Party foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, which pursues an active feminist foreign policy, which is also kind of relatively novel, but becomes more prominent in Europe. Moreover, the German chancellor has shut down, or not allowed the authorization of the Nord Stream gas pipeline. And that was the much discussed gas pipeline between Germany and Russia, right? That will mean major hit for the German energy economy, for German energy security. Again, going back to the question of where to get the alternatives from. But I think it is a wise decision to do so. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I leave it for now. I have much more to say, but I think I can do it later. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. And now to David. If you could discuss the response of the United States to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and what are the implications of this war for US-Russian relations?
Hillary, thanks very much to you and Jenny for inviting me back, and it's great to be with Tatiana and Marcus on this panel. And I see there are a lot of questions piling up, so I'll try to be brief here. The US-Russian relationship, I think, has changed as long as Putin remains in power. I don't see any possibility of a return to any sense of normalcy in US-Russian relations after this egregious abuse of international law, Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity, which President Biden himself today acknowledged that he thinks Putin has committed. President Biden announced today an additional $800 million in security assistance for Ukraine. This is on top of the $13.6 billion that the Congress approved last week in its final budget negotiations, and that is awaiting President Biden's signature. I think the Biden administration deserves a lot of credit in some respects and criticism in others. The credit goes for its extensive coordination with allies in the lead up to Putin's invasion, where it worked very effectively in getting the most effective and swift sanctions in place, including expelling a number of Russian banks from the SWIFT banking system. These sanctions have been unprecedented, and they have had an immediate impact, as Russians could attest by seeing the value of their ruble plummet, interest rates soar, prices skyrocket, and supplies of goods face severe shortages. So average Russians are feeling the effect of this. Oligarchs are feeling the effect of this as the international community freezes and seizes their ill-gotten gains, their assets, their yachts, and other property. And so this has had an immediate effect, and the Russian economy is in trouble as a result of this. Russia failed to prepare for Western sanctions by not moving a lot of its foreign currency reserves into Russian control. Everyone had been talking about the $630 billion that Russia had in foreign currency reserves, overlooking the fact that most of those are kept in the West. And so as a result, Russia does not have access to the vast majority of those reserves. So the Biden administration deserves a lot of credit for that. I think they also deserve credit for beefing up US military presence in countries, NATO countries that border Ukraine and or Russia. That, I think, has been an important signal. I think they also deserve credit for releasing as much classified information as possible without compromising sources and methods that exposes various Russian narratives that they plan to put out. Absurd claims that Ukraine was seeking a nuclear weapon or committing genocide against ethnic Russians in the Donbass region, or all sorts of other nefarious machinations that the Ukrainians are scheming up, when in reality it was the Russians who were scheming all this up. And we've been very effective in diffusing and disarming Russia of a number of these narratives. I think the criticism comes more on the security side, where I think President Biden unnecessarily and repeatedly kept saying how the United States will not put forces on the ground. That may be the right position. I'm not sure I would disagree with that, but I wouldn't telegraph that to Putin. I wouldn't indicate to him what the limitations are of US involvement in this conflict. You don't want to mislead the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians know full well we don't plan to put US forces on the ground. And so it is a mistake to provide strategic clarity, if you will, rather than ambiguity in the case of what the United States will do militarily. I think the United States completely botched this issue of the MiG fighters that Poland was prepared to transfer to Ukraine through Germany. That was handled badly. It shouldn't have been done in public, and the administration deserves criticism for that. I also think that the administration should have done more in terms of providing Ukraine with the military means necessary to defend itself. The Ukrainians have never asked for American soldiers on the ground. They have asked for American weapons and munitions and Stinger missiles and Javelin missiles and all sorts of things, radar and real-time intelligence. The United States has done a fair bit of that, but not enough, and it should have started much sooner. I think we all have underestimated the tremendous heroism and determination of the Ukrainians in defending their country, defending their freedom. And I think everyone also overestimated Russia's military capabilities and Russian planning, which has been borderline disastrous. In part because Putin has sent his forces to invade Ukraine for no good reason. This is a wholly unprovoked invasion, and many of the soldiers that have been sent in by Putin have no idea why they're bombing what Putin has described as one people. Ukraine and Russia, he says, are one people. So why would Russian forces be bombing one people? And then the last issue I'll just mention is the no-fly zone, where President Zelensky today, in his address to the US Congress, which was, if you have not watched it, very much worth watching. It was an inspiring address. He's done this with the Canadian Parliament, the European Parliament, the Bundestag and others, and the UK Parliament. Zelensky has emerged as an incredible hero and leader in this terrible situation. He won with 72% of the vote in 2019 presidential elections. This may be where you want an actor to step into the role as a wartime leader, and he has done so with amazing courage, amazing leadership, and he really needs to be saluted, and support for him in Ukraine has gone through the roof. I think the United States recognizes that, despite some earlier frustrations with him and disagreements that we aired again in public that I don't think was terribly helpful, that Russia's invasion was imminent. Zelensky, I think, knew that. He also wanted to avoid creating a panic inside his country, which was already feeling the effects of people's anticipation of Putin's invasion. So overall, I think the United States can do more on the no-fly zone. The debate here simply is, should NATO and the United States provide cover for humanitarian corridors so that Russian aircraft don't bomb these humanitarian corridors? And the concern of the administration has been that this could lead to direct US-Russian military confrontation. That is a reasonable concern. But I do think the more images that come out where we see more Ukrainians massacred and slaughtered as a result of both discriminate and indiscriminate Russian bombing, we may not be in a choice where we can hold off further on a no-fly zone. We are in, I would argue, the most serious crisis in the world since the end of World War II. It's now not just a European crisis. This is a global crisis. And we are not in a Cold War, we are in a hot war, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And we better do what we can to minimize it as much as possible, recognize the sacrifices that so many Ukrainians are making, and do whatever we can to make Putin pay the biggest price possible. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you all of you for really thoughtful and comprehensive answers to these questions. So the first question is, do you think China and or the Russian oligarchs might have any influence in convincing Putin to end the war with Ukraine?
Well, China and the oligarchs, I'll start.
China and or the Russian oligarchs.
On the oligarchs,
any
no.
Yeah, might they have any influence?
Sorry, I'm sorry, Hillary. The oligarchs are cowards. A lot of them don't keep their money in Russia because they don't trust their own system. They keep it in the West. A lot of them don't even spend much time in Russia. And for the criticism that has been voiced, it is just about it's a shame there's a war. It's a shame Ukrainians are dying. Virtually no oligarch has criticized Putin for ordering this unprovoked and unjustified invasion. And so I wouldn't put any hope or stock in any of these oligarchs. They're all dependent on Putin, and they are cowards, as I said. China's in an awkward spot, I would argue. Remember, Putin went to Beijing for the start of the Olympics in early February, and they issued this long statement in which they said their friendship has no limits. The Chinese, I think, don't particularly like what is happening. I think they're rather unsatisfied with Putin's decision to invade, and yet they don't like the sanctions that the international community has imposed on Putin and Russia. And so they're trying to have it both ways. They're trying to be supportive of Russia on the one hand. They also don't want to cross wires with the United States and the rest of the international community. It's interesting that when a UN General Assembly vote was held about 2 weeks ago condemning Russia for this, China abstained. There was no veto to exercise because it wasn't in the Security Council, but China abstained. They didn't support Russia. The only countries that did, along with Russia, were Belarus, Syria, Eritrea, and North Korea. That's fine company for Putin to be in.
Yeah, if I may just add a little bit about China. So yeah, aside from China sort of being a compass, as was mentioned online, and a bystander, right? Of course, it serves also as a potential, trade diversionary source for Putin's regime, should they be cut off eventually, increasingly through the sanctions and any energy cutbacks. The question about Taiwan, I don't know, the Taiwanese evasion, the possibility of that, right? That looms a little bit large. That would, however, I don't know, maybe for me it seems far-fetched, but the last 4 weeks have shown that things that we considered far-fetched have actually become reality, unfortunately. So we need to watch about that. And I'm just looking at the European Union, they will take a really hard hit if they pursue the goal of rapid energy independence, given that they rely so heavily on Russian oil and gas, to disengage at the same time, from China as well, with which they have very strong trade relationships, will further weaken the European economies, right? So I think the Europeans, as they've done out of maybe normative reasons or not political naivete in the past, they will be also more hesitant to be too aggressive on China. Again, trying to engage China in the hopes that they will be coming out more strongly against Russia. And I think as the situation deteriorates in Ukraine, I don't know, maybe China will change its mind. We don't know.
Thank you. Next question from Kwame Nemo. Clearly, Putin and his yes men have committed egregious war crimes in Ukraine. If we were in a fair world, one avenue they would have been prosecuted is the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Given US's flagrant abhorrence of the court in past times, can the US advocate for this medium to be used to prosecute these war criminals? If not, would this further weaken the court's influence? And there are many questions about the ICC coming in.
I can say a few words about that. I think that we've heard in more recent days that there is demand on the part of the international community for justice, and that there have been many calls to bring Putin and people from the regime to The Hague and to have prosecution. There has been also recently an initiative which was signed by former presidents and heads of state and members of the international scholarly community, by scholars and the people from the intelligentsia, asking for a different type of trial, something along the lines of Nuremberg, or something special and different from The Hague. So we'll see how this will continue. But if there is this demand and pressure on the part of the international community for justice to be served and for this special kind of prosecution, then I think it's likely that we will get to this point.
And can I just quickly add on? Exactly, the International Criminal Court alone will probably likely not succeed. It has been A, not supported by the US itself. B, there has been the impression that the court is also slightly neo-colonial in its heavy emphasis on African states, right? So in the past, it has mostly pursued weaker, let's say, war criminals in that sense. Now, that's not the case, obviously, with Putin, but we've also seen already a negative I think, advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which is the country-to-country court located in The Hague. So, together, I'd always like to tell my students, it takes really it takes a village. It takes an international organization's village, and to work together. We call that sort of the work of interlocking international organizations. And you see now this coming together, what I call sort of a more or less united front of the Western international liberal order, right? However, that means also exactly the fomenting of that oppositionary force, which could be the Russian-Chinese bloc or two separate non-Western blocs.
And just very quickly to add, just because the United States is not a member of the ICC doesn't mean the ICC is not proceeding. And in fact, the Biden administration has voiced support, and there's bipartisan support in the US Congress. I testified last week before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and Chairman Chris Smith, Republican from New Jersey, supports any of these investigations. The ICC, the European Court for Justice, which I think now will be more complicated because the Council of Europe has kicked Russia out, and Russia was going to leave anyway, or a special investigation. I think there's no doubt that Putin and his forces have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the Ukrainians, I'm certain, are going to do everything they can. And in fact, they are already documenting the case to be brought for prosecution of Putin. Whether Putin will ever be brought to justice is a different matter, but I think there's no question that these matters will proceed.
Thank you. Next question is for David. Given the invasion of Ukraine, do you see a Chinese invasion of Taiwan to be possible, whether soon, simultaneously with the war in Ukraine, or later on?
Well, I think what we've just seen in the past few weeks with Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a reminder for those who argue that China should be our focus and we shouldn't get distracted by Europe, that they're utterly wrong. We have to focus on both. We don't have the luxury of picking one or the other. Europe, let's remember, has been the continent that was the source of 2 world wars in the last century. And we don't want to see a 3rd world war originate in Europe, despite Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons. So we have to stay engaged in Europe, and we have to deal with this horrible crisis as it exists right now. At the same time, we have to also focus on China. And we're a big country. We should be able to do both with allies. We shouldn't be doing this on our own. I think the Chinese have to be looking at the reaction of the international community and rethinking any plans they might have had to move against Taiwan. I think the response of the international community, for the most part, has been very encouraging and positive. And the Chinese, I think, really should be careful before they move against Taiwan. It would be mistaken if they thought that we were so distracted with the situation in Ukraine, with the other problems that we have, that they could get away with an invasion of Taiwan. That would be a gross miscalculation on their part.
Tatiana or Marcus, would you like to respond to this?
Not to this, I would like to answer a question which is directed to me later, if not now.
Yes, there was one directed to you, and I'll go back and find it in a second. In the meantime, from Polina Derneva, is there any hope that Putin would stop? Would a coup organized by his people stop him? What are the chances that his people will turn against him?
I mean, if you just maybe quickly start off, and thanks, Paulina. I mean, I think he's cornered, and that makes him obviously more dangerous, right? So, good European that I am, I would hope for a somehow settled agreement. I'm not sure, David, what you suggested earlier, about the Putin, the regime change, that is a realistic option for now. I'm not sure you may know more about sort of the internal insights of Russia and the chances for this, but I see any sort of solution that's somewhat peaceful, that doesn't bring us closer to sort of nuclear chemical weapons, as somehow a partition. And honestly, in all realism, I see Ukraine a little bit like Cyprus, in the sense that maybe there needs to be a UN peacekeeping buffer zone, and we have to, Ukraine has to accept certain territorial losses. in the interest, maybe be again a neutral buffer state in the interest of peace. Unfortunately, I don't see Putin going away for sure.
Well, I'd just say that these regimes seem stable until they're not, and we never know what the tipping point is. I think Putin has made a disastrous decision in invading Ukraine. And I think as the economic squeeze intensifies on average Russians as well as those in Putin's circle, they may come to the realization that their leader is taking them over a cliff. I'm not predicting a coup. I'm not predicting regime change, but I think it is now a possibility. And if you see that Putin has arrested several FSB officials, the FSB is the successor agency to the KGB, he's looking for scapegoats. And yet the problem is he's the one who made this decision. This was a single-handed decision by Putin. And so if he wants to find people who were responsible, he better buy a mirror. And so I do think that those around him are rather concerned about their welfare, that they too might be scapegoated. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's some talk in the, I don't know if it's corridors or wherever it may be, that if they continue down this path, the country is going to be wrecked. In the meantime, Putin's rhetoric just today continues in a very hostile fashion. And so I don't think that Putin is going to let up. I think he wants regime change in Ukraine. And unless and until he achieves it, he's going to keep this bombardment of Ukraine going. But Putin is only as good as the people who are willing to follow his orders. And if you get people who will no longer follow his orders, he becomes an emperor with no clothes, and possibly even an emperor of no more. So I would keep an eye on this, and I wouldn't rule it out completely while not necessarily predicting it.
Thank you.
If I can add something to this,
yes, please.
It's hard to say, because it brings us back to the time of the end of the Cold War, when those regimes collapsed over the course of maybe several months. So it's hard to say what cracks there are within the regime right now, but it's possible that there could be somebody or a group that would be dissatisfied with what's happening. What we have to know is that there is a group of the Siloviki, the apparatchiki, who are keeping him in place, in power, because he has been considered also as a project of the KGB, right. So they would continue to. The moment they think that maybe he's not good for them anymore, there could be change, and I'm not sure in which direction though. If they are the group that prevails, then it would be coming maybe with another similar solution, but they could be a crack within the other part of the regime too. It is very hard to predict.
Thank you. From Ryan Coleman, a question for all of you. Putin's egregious war crimes are another entry in the long, disgusting history of genocide against Ukrainians. With this in mind, is it possible that if Putin wins limited territorial gains in Ukraine, he'll repopulate these regions of Ukraine with ethnic Russians and use that as a validation to annex Ukraine on the basis of legitimacy?
Well, I'll maybe start. Yeah, I mean, I think Ryan was referring to the Holodomor, which was in 1932-33, in which some 3 to 7 million Ukrainians were deliberately starved to death by Joseph Stalin. And Crimean Tatars were all sent into exile in Siberia in the 1940s and only returned when the Soviet Union was collapsing. So Crimean Tatars are Ukrainian citizens, and they've all been treated very badly over the years. The human rights situation in Crimea since Putin illegally annexed the peninsula in 2014 has been atrocious for ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars once again. And the human rights situation in the Russian-controlled areas in Donetsk and Luhansk has been atrocious as well. So let's also not forget how Putin came to power in 1999. He came to power after 4 suspicious apartment bombings that killed 300 Russians. And then he launched a brutal campaign, earth-scorching campaign, scorched earth policy campaign in Chechnya, leveled Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, to the ground. Tens of thousands of Chechens were killed and injured in that campaign. And then, of course, look at what he's done in Syria since intervening in 2015, where Russian forces have been accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The invasion of Georgia in 2008, the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the first time. So there's a track record here, not just going back to the Soviet period, but even under Putin himself.
Marcus?
I mean, we have also exactly, the estimates are that it could be 5, maybe 10 million or more million Ukrainian refugees out of a population of about 40 million. So, at one point he ends up, just with the territory, but not with Ukrainians, right? So that's, it's a little bit absurd, his whole tactic. I mean, it's very much, Hitler in 1938.
Apartment buildings, maternity wards, kindergartens. These are the targets that Russian forces are hitting. I mean, look at the drone scenes coming out of Mariupol, and they deliberately cut off civilians from food and water and electricity. It's cold in Ukraine these days, and these people are suffering, and Putin doesn't give a damn about it.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yes.
Mm-hmm. Since Ryan was, I think he was asking about the repopulation of Ukraine, right? Mm-hmm. It's possible that he might use this policy instrument as Stalin used it in the history of the Soviet Union, but I wouldn't just kind of ignore that. I would consider that as a possible development.
Mm-hmm.
Can we maybe take a minute, because there were a couple of questions related to the, the escalation of war, right? All the way, from chemical weapons to nuclear weapons. And I mean, that's obviously a very sensitive topic. So I don't know if we want to spend, the few rest minutes talking about that.
Please.
Yeah.
So I have one last question, and it does
Sure.
relate to nuclear weapons. This is from Matthew Cortez. Despite the large disparity in military capabilities, have nuclear weapons essentially leveled the playing field between NATO and Russia by facilitating Russia's ability to take such actions without resulting in any military pushback from the international community? How do we guard against this phenomenon in the future? So Marcus.
Well, very quickly, thank you, Matthew. Yes, I would say in part, your question is very well placed, and unfortunately that is true, right? We kind of achieved MAD, or mutual assured destruction, as we call it in IR, and we have more than enough warheads to kind of, bomb the world several times over. So that is certainly a problem, right? That we have to, and you can see this, I think NATO is very careful in sort of not wanting to establish a no-fly zone, not wanting to, actively engage in the conflict as much as possible. Neither do the Europeans. Putin has already bombed that military station very close to the Polish border, right? Sort of as a warning shot to any kind of what he sees as foreign intervention, and therefore active intervention in what he sees as a bilateral conflict. So I think NATO is it's very right to kind of be very careful. How do we guard against this phenomenon in the future? Aside from trying to get rid of nuclear warheads, which, as you know, is a very lengthy, difficult and sensitive topic that we have done over the past, 30 to 40 years. I think we would just need the strength of all the international organizations that we can muster, that they work unisonly and try to make clear that this kind of warfare is not acceptable in the future.
Thank you, Marcus. David?
Yeah, I just, look, you have to take threats of use of nuclear weapons very seriously. They cannot be dismissed lightly, but we also have to remember that we have a nuclear force capability that is equal to, if not better than, Russia's. And so we have to, I think, act with a little more confidence. Instead, whenever Putin makes these threats of using nuclear weapons or chemical or biological weapons, which he claims, by the way, Ukrainians are going to do, when that usually indicates he's more likely to do it, we need to act as the leader of the free world together with our allies. Let's remember the UK and France have nuclear weapons capability. No one wants to see use of nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons, if Putin were to use them in Ukraine, would also kill a lot of Russian forces. But this again reflects how little value Putin attaches to human life, whether it's Russians or Ukrainians. This is all happening, remember, against the backdrop of a tremendous repression inside Russia itself. We've seen the closure of the last independent radio station, the last independent TV station. Really, Novaya Gazeta is the last independent newspaper, and has to publish as if it were on eggshells. It has to be very careful what it does. But we've seen also acts of bravery, as that editor who appeared behind the anchor woman on Channel 1 of Russian TV, holding up that sign. And I imagine much worse fate awaits her, even though she so far only got a relatively small fine imposed. But all of these things, I think, reflect that Putin is desperate. When he asks or encourages Syrian fighters to come join the battle, when he asks China for assistance, and when he has to crack down on Russians and make use of the term war or invasion illegal, those are not signs of a leader who is confident in his own forces' capability to achieve his objectives. And so a lot of this rhetoric, I think, is more hot air, again, not to take it lightly, but we shouldn't be crippled by it either, in my view.
To wrap up, I'd like you, if you would, to answer this question, each of you in turn. What is one issue regarding the war that you think isn't getting enough coverage from the press right now? And Tatiana, let's start with you.
Can I have two?
Yes, go ahead.
I'll be quick. The one thing that I would really want to, the media, I think that we can learn a lot. They have covered so many different aspects, but one thing that, and it's not to blame the media, it's just, this is how the circumstances are. I would like to learn more about the situation in Mariupol. We don't have enough information about that city, and it has been bombed severely, and there are thousands of victims there, casualties. It is really very bad. And the other thing I would like to really know more about is Russia, about the people and how they feel, and how they their attitudes towards the war, and have they changed. It is also a very difficult task, as David was just saying, that we don't have too many independent, actually we have just maybe one left, independent sources of information. So this is also a very difficult task.
Thank you. Marcus?
Oh, yeah. Can I quickly also do two, very quickly?
Yes, please.
So one is related exactly to the conflict directly. And I think there could be more attention put on sort of Transnistria, which is sort of the Russian-speaking breakaway region from Moldova. It is, if you look at it, it's very strategically located. There are 1,500 Russian troops there, so it's west of Odessa. And, you know, the fear is that Putin will try, right, to capture Odessa and then sort of basically cut off Ukraine anyway from the southern coast. So that's something, but there's so much attention on the conflict itself that I think the really big thing will be, of course, the long-term effects again of the refugee crisis in the region, and then also the emerging food crisis. Ukraine has been supplying half of the UN's World Food Program for Middle East and North Africa last year, half of the supply. Right? That's all by the wayside now. So we're going to have to expect many more humanitarian crises in Middle East, North Africa. You know, Afghanistan conflict is still raging, Somalia, I mean, Yemen, we have all these other conflicts. And there is a fear among many other humanitarian activists that the conflict literally sucks a lot of oxygen, you know, and it takes away attention from all the other pressing needs, unfortunately.
Yes, and David?
Well, since Tatiana and Marcus gave two, let me do two as well. The first, just to maybe reinforce what Tatiana had said, and that is trying to get a better sense of what the Russian people really think. Conducting surveys in Russia in so-called normal conditions is really difficult in itself. Conducting them now in the current incredibly repressive environment is nearly impossible. There was a film poll that was just released that shows about 60% support for Putin in this decision. His approval rating was at around 60 some odd percent. So we have not seen a huge drop in it, but I don't think that reflects the real views of the majority of Russians who, despite Kremlin propaganda, blaming the West, blaming Ukraine, I think even a lot of Russians no longer believe that. And that's why I think that what that editor did on, was it Monday, was so important in holding up that sign. The other thing is the tremendously awful toll this is taking on Ukrainians who will suffer from post-traumatic stress. They are losing lives, the injuries, that image of the pregnant woman being brought out of the maternity ward, she and her not yet born infant died in that bombing. This is, I think, incalculable, the toll that this is having. The damage and property, as awful as that is, can be repaired, but you can't replace human life. And so I think we have to start thinking about helping the Ukrainians addressing these needs as quickly as possible. And for those who have been displaced, to do whatever we can, including, by the way, the United States needs to do a better job, I would argue, in accepting Ukrainians into our country here. The Europeans are bearing the tremendous burden, but we have a responsibility here as well. So Hillary and Yanni and everyone, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure to be with Marcus and Tatiana, and I appreciate everyone's joining today.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for giving us your insights today, and for the listeners for tuning in. Next one, I think we'll just have questions because there's so many questions that we haven't gotten to. So please visit our website, goglobal.fiu.edu, for resources and information on upcoming events. Thank you.
Thank you.